Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Carreira, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, even though I'm needing to do it by recording. And before I do anything else, I want to congratulate you on the 5 years that you have been gathering this way, and I hope that you'll continue to do it into the future. It's very inspiring to see this level of commitment to awakening manifest the way that you have consistently manifested for these past 5 years. I realize that this is the last hour of your day today, and what I wanted to share with you was some of the instruction that I gave recently on retreat in Sri Lanka. So that was an 8-day silent retreat, and the instructions that I'm going to share with you today came from the 6th day of the retreat. On that retreat, I was doing something that I haven't done so much before, which is I was sharing meditation, very influenced by more traditional Advaita Vedanta ideas, and particularly the teachings of Ramana Maharshi. So you'll be hearing that in the audio. Jnana Yoga, for those of you who may not know the term, is the specific practice, domain of practice that Ramana worked in. Jnana Yoga basically means the pursuit of insight or wisdom. It's the effort to recognize the true self and to recognize yourself as the true self. And in that system of thinking, there are 5 stages of consciousness. There is normal waking consciousness, there is dreaming consciousness, there is deep sleep consciousness, and then there is Turiya, which is the all-pervading awareness beyond that. And then there is Turiyatita, which means beyond Turiya, which occurs when one becomes completely absorbed in the all-pervading consciousness beyond all objects. So I just offer those words because I mentioned them in the audio, and I wanted to give you a little context for that. And so with that, I am going to play the teaching that I gave on the 6th day of a silent retreat and allow that to inspire the rest of your practice. So thank you all very much, and I hope you have and have had a wonderful day. So I just wanted to say a few more words about practice. In order to keep articulating the practice more clearly, in the hopes that it will help you actually do the practice. So I wanted to present the practice that we're doing on this retreat as essentially a 3-stage process, 2 of which we've spoken more about, and one is the one I always speak about. So the first stage of the meditation practice is the practice of no problem. So that just means sitting and not making a problem out of anything that happens. So that's that's a more technique-based meditation. So it's the easiest for the separate sense of self, the small s self, to practice and to understand and to grasp. So if someone comes to me in a meditation class, who's never had a particular spiritual experience, who's completely identified with this body, completely believes that they were born on the day this body appeared in the world and they will die and be gone on the day this body ends, and is completely identified with their history and their mind and their thoughts and their fears and their worries and concerns, and they come into a meditation class and they say, I'm so anxious and I'm full of self-doubt and self-concern, and it's ruining my life. Can meditation help? You can say, yes, meditation can help. You should practice the practice of no problem, which just means sit and don't make a problem out of anything that happens. No matter what thoughts arise or what feelings, you just don't make a problem out of them. You just let them be exactly what they are. And a person can practice that, and usually in a fairly short amount of time recognize that they get some relief from the mind by doing that. And if they do it consistently, they'll find that the relief they experience from their mind in meditation starts to also create more space and more distance between them and their mind outside of meditation. So then they might get hooked on meditation and want to do some every day, because they start to feel like, well, my life is much better when I'm meditating. And if I skip my practice for a few days, I realize I start to get more wrapped up in my mind and more anxious. So that's a very technique-based approach to meditation. It's very accessible, and the value of it is very apparent to the separate sense of self, to the small s self, to the ego self. And that's the first stage of practice. And it's the foundation of everything that we're doing here. As I said at the beginning, the practice of no problem is always it's always the floor. You don't want to fall any lower than no problem. So the next stage of practice that we've been talking about is resting in unself-conscious awareness. So if you start with the practice of no problem, and you are very engaged in the practice in a way that's very technique-based, as I said, it's also very achievement-based, generally, because it's the separate sense of self doing it. The separate sense of self has an agenda, usually overcoming neuroses, and therefore it's doing the practice with a certain achievement orientation. It's trying to achieve peace of mind through the practice. So you start with that, but then at some point you actually start getting into it, and you enter into a more transitional phase of practice. And that's a phase where absorption starts to occur, which basically means you start getting into it. And as you start to get into it, and you start to get into this sense of peace and ease of being, you start to forget yourself. Like anything else that you start to enjoy, you start to forget yourself doing it, because you're just actually enjoying it now. You're enjoying the arising of thought and feeling. You're enjoying the experience of being free from reactivity, free from preference, where you're just feeling, wow, every thought arises, and every next thought arises, and every feeling, and every next feeling, and I don't feel reactive anymore. I don't feel caught in any of them. They just come and go, and then eventually you start forgetting yourself, and there's just thoughts coming and going, feelings coming and going, and this sense of enjoyment. So when you're practicing resting in unself-conscious awareness, you're forgetting the small self. You're forgetting who you are. And you're just absorbed in whatever's arising. And your orientation to practice moves from being achievement-oriented to being enjoyment-oriented. So you're actually starting to enjoy meditation. So when people get to this point in practice, they don't just practice because, in the first stage, people will say they practice because if they don't practice, then they feel the negative effects. But then you start to become the kind of person who meditates because they enjoy it. I enjoy meditating. I enjoy forgetting myself for a half hour a day or an hour a day. And then the third stage of practice that we've talked about is resting in non-conceptual awareness. So if you're absorbed in this kind of unconscious, unself-conscious practice, and you forget yourself, and you just start to enjoy the freedom and ease of being, eventually that mysterious sense of freedom and ease of being becomes much more interesting to you than the content of any particular thought or any particular feeling. Exactly what thoughts or feelings are saying starts to become less and less interesting, and this steady, ongoing sense of just easeful awareness becomes more and more compelling. And that's when you start to experience the consciousness that's always there behind every thought and feeling, which you realize is a different consciousness than the consciousness that recognizes the thoughts and feelings, that knows what they mean, that feels how they feel. And this is a consciousness that's behind all that, that doesn't really know or feel anything. It just experiences the ease of peaceful awareness. And so that's why it's mysterious, because it can't really be known in the way that the waking state consciousness knows things, because it doesn't know things as objects separate from itself. It's just this easeful, steady, peaceful sense of awareness. And as that becomes more prominent, the thoughts and feelings fall away. They don't necessarily stop, but they become further and further distant because you're less and less interested in them. And you start to fall in love with this delicate consciousness of pure awareness. And so your practice moves from being enjoyment-based to love-based, because more and more what's guiding your meditation is not the fact that you enjoy doing it, but the fact that you're in love with what becomes apparent to you when you're doing it, which, if we were in a more religious context, we would say that all-pervading awareness is God. And that's why in a religious context, you would say that in your meditation, you are communing with God and you are falling in love with God. Ramana wouldn't tend to say that. He would recognize that people will say that in a bhakta context, in a love of God context. But in a jnana context, he would say you're communing with the self, the big self. And that's when Ramana says things like, the big S self and God are the same thing. So the jnana is kind of approaching it from the big S self point of view, and the bhakti is approaching it from the love of God point of view, but in essence, it's the same thing. So then your practice is a love-based, resting in non-conceptual awareness, or, if we want to use the Eastern terminology, resting in Turiya, falling in love with Turiya, recognizing that Turiya is always the source of wisdom and love, and always has been. And at that point, all you want to do is commune and become more and more deeply absorbed in that experience. And then if you do that long enough, as we were saying yesterday, you might go beyond Turiya into Turiyatita, which means a complete forgetting of separate existence and a perfect union with that awareness. There's no trace of separation left. So in a religious context, that would be considered to be perfect union with God. In a jhana context, it's perfect union with the true self. So that's how I want you to think about your practice today. The practice of no problem is the achievement-oriented, more technique-based practice of simply not making a problem out of anything that occurs. Resting in unself-conscious awareness means forgetting yourself as you're practicing no problem, forgetting who's practicing, forgetting that you're meditating, and just starting to enjoy the flow of consciousness. So you're moving from an achievement orientation to an enjoyment orientation. And then the third stage of the practice is resting in non-conceptual awareness. In which you start to become more and more deeply aware of that consciousness, that all-pervading awareness that exists beyond the awareness of any specific thing or specific knowledge or particular feeling. So beyond that, there's just this pure open awareness that's always present. And your meditation starts to become just being with that awareness, falling in love with that awareness. So you're moving from enjoyment orientation to love orientation. So those are the three stages of this practice. And of course, things never work linearly, 1, 2, 3. So at any given moment on the retreat, you may find yourself engaged in one or the other of those based on all kinds of factors and circumstances, inner and outer. And so I offer those distinctions in the hopes that it will help you better understand the practice and also completely embrace whichever level of practice you happen to find yourself engaged in at any given moment. Because ultimately, we don't want to have an achievement orientation to these three stages either. It's not like they're a progression. You have to go from 1 to 2 to 3, and if you're at 3, you're somehow a winner. And if you're at 1, you're not a winner. That's not how practice works. We're always internally at different places. So sometimes we just are, for whatever reason, more rooted in the small self, in which case the practice of no problem is going to be the practice that is easiest to grasp and is the one that will naturally arise. But of course, as you get on retreat and you start forgetting your small self, then the next 2 levels of practice will start to become apparent. And there may be moments in which you are just very free and open, and in which the Turiya, all-pervading, pure consciousness is very apparent, in which case the most obvious thing to do is going to be to rest in it. And there may be times when you're in between those two, and you're enjoying sitting, but you're not quite experiencing Turiya, but you're also not simply mechanically making yourself have no problem. You just actually don't have a problem, and you're enjoying sitting there. So however your practice shows up in any given moment, you don't want to try to get to some imagined next level. You just want to be with the practice as it's happening, and then see where it goes.